Number 1. Shanda Sharer. On the night of January 11, 1992, in a quiet rural area of Indiana, a 12-year-old girl stepped out of her home, believing she was about to meet a friend. No one knew that this would be the last time she would look up at the night sky, the last time she would walk forward as a child whose life was still innocent and unbroken. Her name was Shanda Sharer. She was not famous. She was not someone who caused trouble or made enemies. And she was certainly not someone who deserved to be harmed. She was simply a child, growing up while trying to understand emotions that had only just begun to take shape. But that night, Shanda was confronted with a cruel truth. Evil does not always wear the face of adults. Sometimes, it takes the form of teenagers, girls still in school, still considered children themselves. What shocked the entire United States was not only the way Shanda's life came to an end, but the disturbing question that lingered for decades afterward. How could people so young, still at the very beginning of life, remain calm while causing such deep and lasting pain? And when the line between youth and crime becomes blurred, should judgment be guided by the law alone, or by the conscience we carry as human beings? Shanda Sharer was only 12 years old in age when a child still believes that the world is, at its core, a safe place. She lived between two households, went to school, had friends, and experienced the innocent early feelings that anyone who has passed through adolescence can understand. Shanda was not rebellious, nor was she someone who sought attention. She was quiet, trusting, and deeply wanted to be accepted and loved, just like any other child. To her family, Shanda was still a little girl who needed protection. To her friends, she was simply a young girl learning to understand her own emotions. But in the eyes of those who targeted her, Shanda was no longer seen as a person with fears, joy, and hope. She was reduced to an object, a name within a story driven by jealousy, one she was far too young to fully comprehend. Most heartbreaking of all, Shanda never knew she was in danger. She stepped into that night with the simple trust of a child, believing that the people who called her outside were her friends. It was that innocence so human and so fragile that makes Shanda's story more haunting than any detail that followed. Behind Shanda's quiet disappearance were individuals who were still very young, yet allowed their emotions to lead them toward a decision with no return. Melinda Loveless, 16 years old, was the one who set everything in motion. In the inner world of an emotionally immature teenager, jealousy was not just sadness or hurt, it became an obsession. Shanda's connection with someone Melinda once dated was seen not as something to move past, but as a betrayal, a humiliation she could not accept. Melinda did not choose to walk away. She did not choose to let go. She chose revenge. Standing beside her was Lori Tackett, 17, a girl who had shown signs of emotional instability from a very young age. Lori did not need a personal grievance against Shanda. What she found in Melinda was something else entirely: shared darkness, a sense of belonging, the feeling of being part of something powerful. In that moment, the pain of someone else no longer mattered. What mattered was not being left behind. The other two teenagers did not intervene. They listened to the stories filled with resentment. They accepted the narrative that had been shaped for them. And they chose silence. That agreement, quiet, deliberate, and unchallenged, was the most disturbing part. None of them acted on impulse. They thought it through. They discussed it. And they made a decision that Shanda would be made to pay. From that moment on, jealousy was no longer a passing emotion of youth. It became the driving force behind a crime formed through cold, conscious choice. That night, they called Shanda using ordinary words that gave a 12-year-old no reason to feel suspicious. Familiar voices. A simple invitation. Nothing that hinted at danger. Shanda got into the car with childlike trust, unaware that the moment the door closed, she was being separated from the safe world she had always known. The car moved away from the neighborhood. Streetlights became fewer, replaced by the darkness of the quiet outskirts. No one told Shanda where they were going. No one explained why they weren't turning back. The silence inside the car grew heavy, but for a child, unease had not yet become fear. She still believed she was among people she knew. Eventually, They stopped at a remote location locals referred to by a chilling nickname, the Witch's Castle. There was no castle there, only crumbling walls and deep shadows. It was in this forgotten place that Shanda realized she was no longer a guest. She had become a victim, held there not by forceful words, but by silence, by a growing sense of fear, and by a trap she had never been warned about. In that isolated place, everything unfolded with a terrifying slowness. Shanda was held there among four people she had once believed were her friends. There were no chaotic outbursts, no loss of control, only a sequence of actions deliberate, calculated, and chillingly calm. She was restrained, she was hurt. Each moment passed in the heavy silence of the night. For a 12-year-old child, every minute felt endless. Shanda cried, she begged, she tried to explain, using all the innocence and confusion of someone still far too young to understand what was happening. But her words reached no one. In the eyes of those standing around her, Shanda was no longer seen as a frightened child. She had been reduced to something else, an outlet for anger, a means to assert control, a way to fill the distorted emptiness inside them. What made it even more devastating was not only the suffering itself, but the complete absence of mercy. No one stopped. No one said it was enough. No one chose to step away. Time continued to pass, and the cruelty did not fade. Each moment was a choice, and again, they chose to continue. In the darkness of the place known as the Witch's Castle, humanity was worn away piece by piece. The tragedy did not reach its peak through a single act, but through its duration, through the fact that a child was forced to endure an experience far beyond what any young mind could understand or accept. When the suffering they had already caused was still not enough to satisfy that distorted anger, another decision was made, one even colder, even more unforgivable. Shanda was taken back toward the car. She was confined inside a narrow, airless space, separated from the outside world. In that darkness, a child could do nothing but curl inward, overwhelmed by fear. When the door closed, Shanda was cut off from safety for the final time. Inside, she was still alive, still aware, feeling the movement of the vehicle, counting each moment in silent desperation. The car eventually stopped in an empty field, far from homes, far from lights, far from anyone who could hear a cry for help. They opened the car and pulled Shanda out. She was weak and terrified, but she was still breathing. Even then, there was time to stop, time to turn back, time to choose humanity. They did not. What followed crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. A final act erased not only a young life, but every remaining boundary of conscience. What shocked the entire nation was not only what they did, but the fact that they returned again, not to show mercy, but to ensure that nothing remained. Not a trace of Shanda Sharer. Not a trace of a child who once existed. A child who trusted. A child who was human. Several days later, in the cold emptiness of an open field, a hunter made a discovery no one should ever have to make. What remained no longer resembled a complete body, only burned remnants that made it almost impossible to accept that they had once belonged to a child. Shanda's identity was confirmed through dental records, a clinical detail that carried an unbearable weight of grief. Her family learned the truth in the cruelest way possible, as the last fragile thread of hope was finally extinguished. The investigation moved faster than many expected. Public outrage and the pressure of a shocked community left little room for secrecy. Confessions began to surface. Piece by piece, the story came together. Inside interrogation rooms, teenage girls who had once laughed, gone to school, and lived ordinary lives began to recount what they had done. There was no longer bravado, only emptiness, and explanations so small they could never soften the loss that had been caused. When sentencing was handed down, the court attempted to define the crime through numbers. 60 years in prison for Lori Tackett. Severe sentences for the others involved. Yet no punishment could bring Shanda back. No ruling could truly close the wound left behind for her family. In that moment, justice was carried out according to the law. But the deeper question, the one about human conscience, remained unanswered, hanging heavily in the silence that followed. The case of Shanda Sharer did not end when the prison doors closed. It continued to live on in public debate for decades. People asked how teenagers only 16 or 17 years old could commit acts of such cruelty. Some called for even harsher sentences, viewing the crime as pure evil, beyond forgiveness. Others, however, asked a different and more uncomfortable question: what did society fail to see? What signs were overlooked? What unresolved emotional trauma, broken homes, or lost children had been ignored long before that night? The debate was not only about punishment. It was about responsibility. The responsibility of families, of schools, of communities, and of all of us. If a child can become a perpetrator, how many warning signs were missed along the way? And if a child can become a victim, was her vulnerability ever truly protected? Shanda's story is not just a criminal case. It is a painful reminder of the fragile line between youth and darkness, of how jealousy, resentment, and violence, when left unchecked, can destroy far more lives than we expect. And sometimes, the most frightening thing is not evil itself, but the silence that allows it to grow before anyone intervenes. Number 2. Nicole Jackson. There was a moment that left everyone watching in stunned silence. A young voice, still unsteady, still carrying the fragility of being only 14, cut through the night. "I will take all of you down." It was not the voice of a trained extremist, not the voice of a hardened criminal. It was the cry of a child standing in confrontation with the police. When the first shot was fired, the boundary between victim and perpetrator began to collapse. The question was no longer simply about right or wrong. It became something far more unsettling. What could drive a teenager to stand against the entire system of law enforcement, armed and prepared to face consequences far beyond their age? Nicole Jackson was 14 years old, an age that should have been filled with school days, friendships, and the first quiet dreams of the future. But her life did not include those things. Nicole grew up within the foster care system, a place where stability is often a luxury. Temporary homes, adults who came and went, and the constant feeling of belonging nowhere. Very little public information exists about Nicole's biological family. What is known is that she was separated from any lasting sense of protection early on. Long before the night that would define her story, Nicole had learned how to survive rather than how to be loved. A child with nowhere to return often begins searching for a place to escape. Nicole ran away from her foster home, not out of rebellion, but out of a feeling of being trapped. Alongside a 12-year-old boy, Nicole wandered without direction. No money, no plan, only the fear of being forced back to a place she did not want to return to. They broke into a house, and there, Nicole saw something that would change everything. A collection of weapons, an AK-style rifle, handguns, ammunition. In the hands of a desperate teenager, weapons are not just objects. They become something else entirely, a rare sense of control in a life that had never truly belonged to her. When police arrived, they believed they were responding to something routine. A typical break-in, an ordinary call. What they did not expect was what followed. Instead of surrender, shots were fired. Rounds from an AK-style rifle cut through the air. Officers were forced to take cover as parts of the structure around them gave way. What should have been a simple situation turned into something no one was prepared for. 30 minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly. A real standoff between law enforcement officers and a 14-year-old child. Body camera footage captured Nicole's voice, shaking, angry, and filled with desperation. Nicole did not act in blind panic. She acted with intent. That point was later emphasized by prosecutors, that she understood what she was doing, that her actions were deliberate. But it was also the moment when society fell into an uneasy silence. How could a child maintain that level of resolve? How could a teenager be willing to face death, or cause it simply to avoid returning to a place she feared? Fortunately, no lives were lost. No officers were killed. No further harm was done. Yet the damage did not disappear. The psychological impact on everyone involved, the officers, the community, and Nicole herself, was permanent. When the gunfire stopped, Nicole was taken into custody. A small framed girl, hands restrained, eyes empty. There were no more challenges, no more shouting. Only a child who had lost her childhood completely. The 12-year-old boy who had been with Nicole was also detained. 2 children, Two lives, two paths abruptly cut short. Nicole was charged as an adult. First-degree attempted murder, burglary, property damage. The decision sent shockwaves through the public. Some believed it was necessary to send a message, to deter others. Others saw it as a profound failure of the system itself. In 2023, Nicole entered a no-contest plea. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. A heavy number, placed on the shoulders of someone who had never truly been allowed to live a life in the first place. The case of Nicole Jackson deeply divided public opinion. Some saw only a dangerous individual holding a weapon. Others saw a child abandoned by every system that was meant to protect her. The question was never just whether Nicole was guilty. It was why a teenager could so easily reach a point of no return. If Nicole had received help earlier, would that night have unfolded the same way? If the system had focused not only on control, but on understanding, could this tragedy have been prevented? This story does not end in a courtroom. It remains in the questions society still struggles to answer. Are we punishing an individual, or are we quietly covering up our own collective failure? Number 3. Chloe Copan Anderson. Some cries at birth are never heard. There are no waiting arms, no words of blessing, only a closed room and a 16-year-old girl trembling in the dark. And when the door finally opens, what is found is not the miracle of life, but a question so heavy it leaves society holding its breath. How much guilt can a teenager truly carry on their shoulders? Chloe Copan Anderson grew up in a home that was far from peaceful. Her childhood was not shaped by warm memories, but by silence, fear, and long-lasting emotional harm. She was mistreated. She was neglected. And there was no adult who stepped in to protect her. By the time Chloe turned 15, she was carrying a burden no one around her knew about. A pregnancy and a fear even greater than becoming a mother, the fear of being discovered. Chloe told no one, not her family, not her friends, not a doctor. She continued living as if nothing had changed, going to school, eating meals, hiding her body beneath loose clothing. With each passing day, the fear grew stronger. Fear of being blamed, fear of punishment, fear of being abandoned once again. No one had ever taught her that she had the right to ask for help. In November 2023, inside her familiar bedroom, Chloe gave birth alone. There were no nurses, no ambulance sirens, only panic, pain, and isolation. The child was born a baby boy. But instead of joy, Chloe saw only collapse. In her mind, her life was already over. The future she imagined no longer existed. And in that moment, overwhelmed, terrified, and completely alone, a decision was made that could never be undone. Chloe turned to a kitchen knife, not in madness but in overwhelming desperation. What followed happened quickly, quietly, with a chilling finality. Afterward, she tried to hide everything as if silence could erase what had happened. As if, by keeping it unseen, the reality might simply disappear. But the truth cannot remain buried forever. Chloe's parents began to notice that something was wrong. Signs that could no longer be ignored. Authorities were called. The investigation quickly confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The child was no longer alive. The evidence was clear. The scene. The object involved. Chloe's own statement. Chloe was taken into custody, a teenager, a mother, and now a defendant. In court, the defense did not deny what had happened. Instead, they spoke about Chloe's childhood marked by mistreatment, severe depression, and post-traumatic stress. No one intervened. No one helped. No one noticed. Chloe entered a no-contest plea. There was no lengthy trial, no attempt to deny responsibility. In April 2025, the sentence was handed down. 35 to 60 years in prison. Chloe will be at least 51 years old before she is eligible for freedom. The case of Chloe Copan deeply divided public opinion. Some labeled her an unforgivable killer. Others saw the case as a collective failure of the adults around her. A teenage girl carried a pregnancy in silence, without education, without protection, without anyone truly listening. The newborn was the final victim. But Chloe herself was also the result of years of neglect and abandonment. This case forces society to confront one of its most difficult questions. Are we punishing an individual, or are we punishing our own indifference? Number 4. Sunshine Grace James. Some shots are fired to save a life. Others are fired when everything is still and quiet. That night, inside a small apartment in Florida, 2 people were asleep. There was no argument, no struggle, no immediate sign of danger. And then, a gunshot broke the silence. The person who fired was a 15-year-old girl. She later said she acted in self-defense. The question that shook the public was this: can something truly be called self-defense when the perceived threat was asleep? Sunshine Grace James lived with her mother and her mother's fiancé, Christopher Moore. From the outside, it appeared to be a family trying to build a new life together. But inside the home, long-standing tensions quietly persisted. Sunshine described her daily life as one lived in fear. She said she felt threatened, harmed, and unprotected. These claims would later become the center of the case, because not all of them could be supported by clear evidence. Christopher Moore was 35 years old. He was Sunshine's mother's fiancé, preparing to step into the role of a stepfather. There was no record of serious violent offenses, no clear evidence that he posed an immediate threat on the night in question. However, in Sunshine's account, Christopher was the source of a long-standing fear. A fear that was difficult to prove but also impossible to simply dismiss. In August 2023, the apartment was silent, wrapped in sleep. Sunshine was holding a firearm as she entered the bedroom. Christopher Moore was asleep. So was Sunshine's mother, Alexis Pineda, lying beside him. There were no raised voices. No struggle. Sunshine pulled the trigger. Christopher Moore was struck and died at the scene. A second shot hit her mother. Alexis survived, but carried injuries both physical and emotional that would remain with her long after. Before the shot was fired, Sunshine said one sentence: "Mom, I love you all." That moment sent a chill through prosecutors, because it suggested awareness, not a sudden, panicked reaction. It was the moment when the line between self-defense and calculation became most blurred. Police moved in quickly. The scene showed no signs of a struggle beforehand. Forensic findings confirmed that the victims were asleep at the time the shots were fired, directly contradicting a claim of self-defense under the law. Sunshine was taken into custody after leaving the scene. A teenager, a firearm, and a defense that would soon ignite intense public debate. The legal proceedings stretched on for 2 years. The defense focused on accumulated fear built up over time. Prosecutors emphasized planning and timing. In September 2025, Sunshine entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. She did not admit motive, but she accepted criminal responsibility. Sentencing has not yet been finalized. The minimum penalty is 25 years in prison. It could extend to life. The case of Sunshine Grace deeply divided society. Some believe she was a victim of long-term fear. Others believe she crossed a line that can never be undone. Self-defense requires an immediate threat, but psychological fear has no visible form. If a child feels there is no way out, who bears responsibility before a weapon is ever raised? Sunshine Grace is not only a defendant. She is a warning that when fear goes unheard, tragedy can unfold in silence. And sometimes, the most frightening thing is not the sound of a shot, but the damage that had been building long before anyone noticed. Number 5. Charlie Ely. Some people are convicted not because they took a life, but because they stood too close to evil. An 18-year-old girl. She did not pull the trigger. She did not carry out the act herself. And yet, she received a life sentence. It would take nearly a decade before the justice system began to ask the question that should have been asked from the beginning. Did they convict the right person? Charlie Ely grew up struggling with serious mental health challenges: bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety. She was not a leader. She was not violent. She was not someone who sought confrontation. Charlie was the kind of teenager who was easily influenced, eager to please, quick to comply, and deeply afraid of conflict. In relationships, she was often the one who gave in. And it was that very vulnerability that placed her in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Seth Jackson was 15 years old, a teenager drawn into a complicated web of emotional conflict among peers. On the night everything changed, Seth was lured to a house in Florida. He believed he was going there to talk, to resolve a disagreement. But what awaited him was not a conversation. It was a coordinated attack. The investigation relied heavily on testimony from company defendants, individuals who were actively trying to reduce their own responsibility. Charlie became the weakest link. The easiest person to blame, the least capable of defending herself within the legal system. The jury heard a story that had already been shaped and arranged, and a life sentence was handed down. Charlie entered prison while she was still a teenager, carrying untreated mental illness, carrying a conviction for a crime she has always maintained she did not directly commit. Years passed. Seth's family lived with unbearable loss. Charlie deteriorated behind bars, and yet the question never disappeared. Was justice truly served? In 2020, an appeals court overturned the life sentence. Not because Charlie was declared innocent, but because her defense attorney had failed in their duty. They did not challenge key arguments. They did not adequately protect their client's rights. Rather than face a new trial, Charlie accepted a plea to second-degree murder, a 10-year sentence, and with time already served, she was released from prison. Seth's family was outraged. Someone connected to their son's death had been released. Public opinion split sharply. Some believed Charlie had been sacrificed to quickly close the case. Others felt the reduced sentence was an insult to the victim. The case of Charlie Ely offers no complete answers, only a bitter truth. Justice does not depend on truth alone. It also depends on who stands up to defend that truth. And when the system fails, the consequences can follow a person for an entire lifetime. Number 6. Ashley Martinson. Some families appear completely ordinary from the outside, but inside, harm can grow quietly, day after day, without cries for help. And at a certain point, that silence can no longer hold. It breaks, with irreversible consequences. That night, a 17-year-old girl held a gun, and her family would never be the same again. Ashley Martinson grew up in a home where fear was a familiar presence. Her stepfather, Thomas Eyes, had a serious criminal record. Harm and aggression were not strangers inside that house. Ashley later said she endured mistreatment for many years, not only physical, but emotional as well. What hurt the most was the isolation. Because according to Ashley, the person who should have protected her, her mother, did not. Before the tragedy unfolded, Ashley had repeatedly shown signs of deep despair. Dark social media posts, words that hinted at wanting everything to end. One statement she posted online later became a key piece of evidence used against her. "I want him gone." To prosecutors, it suggested intent and preparation. To the defense, it was the cry of a child pushed to the edge, someone expressing pain, not planning a crime. On March 7, 2015, inside a home in Wisconsin, everything reached a breaking point. Ashley picked up a firearm. Her stepfather was the first to be struck. Moments later, she turned toward her mother, the person who, in Ashley's eyes, had failed to protect her. What happened next unfolded quickly. Not with the chaos of a random act, but with the release of years of pressure compressed into just a few irreversible minutes. Ashley said she had no other choice, that if she had not acted, she would not have survived. But the scene told a different story. Investigators found no evidence that the victims were attacking her at that moment. That fact made a claim of self-defense increasingly fragile. The central question of the case was never simply whether Ashley had taken lives. It was whether she had been pushed slowly, repeatedly, to a point from which there was no return. After what happened, Ashley fled with her younger siblings. She placed them inside a closet, believing it would shield them from what had just occurred. She was later arrested in Indiana. At first, she claimed self-defense. Later, she acknowledged responsibility for her actions. Ashley entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. By doing so, she avoided a trial, one in which her own younger siblings would have been required to testify. In 2016, Ashley was sentenced to 23 years in prison, a ruling that sharply divided public opinion. Some viewed it as necessary leniency, given the circumstances she described. Others argued that nothing could justify the loss of 2 lives. Subsequent appeals were denied. Ashley Martinson remains incarcerated today. In interviews from prison, she has said that for the first time in her life, she feels safe. A statement that sent a chill through many who heard it. This case forces society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Abuse does not always end a life immediately, but it can create the conditions in which death becomes possible. Ashley was both a perpetrator and a product of prolonged harm. There is no answer that satisfies everyone, only a question that continues to linger. If protection had come sooner, would 2 lives still be here today? Number 7. Sofia Koval. Some battles do not require guns. They follow people far from their homeland, slipping into their homes, their meals, their sleep. And on an afternoon that seemed entirely ordinary in Florida, the consequences of war erupted. Not through bombs or gunfire, but through the death of a 79-year-old grandmother at the hands of her own granddaughter. Sofia Koval was 14 years old. She left Ukraine with her family to escape the war. For adults, it was described as a search for safety. For a child, it was loss. Sofia witnessed things no child should ever have to see: explosions, panic, the helpless feeling of watching the world fall apart. When she arrived in the United States, the war no longer existed outside her window, but it was still alive inside her mind. Sofia's family lived with her grandmother, Yevgenia, an elderly woman, frail and in need of care. Different language, different culture, a completely different rhythm of life. Sofia struggled to communicate. She struggled in school. She struggled to regulate her emotions. Sudden bursts of anger, overwhelming reactions, signs that experts would later identify as psychological trauma. But at the time, no one truly understood what she was going through. That day, the conflict began over something small. Sofia's grandmother took her phone. To an adult, it was discipline. To a child living with trauma, it felt like the final loss of control. Anger surged, suddenly, overwhelmingly, without time to think. Sofia reacted using objects within reach, items from the room itself. In that moment, there was no reasoned thought, only fear, panic, and a mind overtaken by distress. Yevgenia was unable to defend herself. Age and illness had left her completely vulnerable. When everything was over, a life had been lost, and a child was left standing in the aftermath, facing a reality she herself could not fully understand. There was no elaborate cover-up, no plan, only the complete collapse of a young, overwhelmed mind. Police quickly determined the cause of death. Sofia was taken into custody, but the investigation did not focus on actions alone. Psychological experts were brought in. They spoke about post-traumatic stress disorder, about the long-term effects of war on children, about how an undeveloped brain responds when pushed beyond its limits. Sofia was charged with manslaughter, not intentional murder. The court deliberated, carefully balancing the need to protect society with the chance to save a child from complete destruction. The final sentence was 3 years within the juvenile justice system, focused on psychological treatment rather than severe punishment. The case of Sofia Koval did not ignite public outrage, but it left a deep sense of unease. Some believed the sentence was too lenient. Others saw it as a rare act of compassion. The larger question lies elsewhere. For adults, war may end, but for children, it can last a lifetime. Sofia is not only a defendant. She is proof that trauma, when left untreated, can turn into harm. And sometimes, what society needs is not harsher punishment, but earlier intervention, to prevent tragedy before a child is forced to pay the price for wounds they never chose to carry. Number 8. The Whitehead twins. Some bonds are believed to be unbreakable. Blood ties, the bond between a mother and her children. But inside a home in Georgia, that bond ended in violence. Not at the hands of one child but 2 twin sisters. And the person who lost her life was their own mother. Jesmia and Tasmia Whitehead were born on the same day and raised under the same roof. They shared everything from identical faces to a bond so close it seemed impossible to separate. But their childhood was far from peaceful. The household was often unstable. Arguments, raised voices, and long-standing conflict were part of daily life. When their parents divorced, the sisters' world became even more unsettled. Stability faded, and safety was no longer something they could take for granted. Nikki Whitehead was 34 years old, the mother of the twin girls. Her life had not been easy either. The weight of providing, raising children alone amid instability. Over time, the relationship between Nikki and her daughters grew increasingly strained. Arguments escalated. Words were exchanged that left lasting wounds. The tension reached a breaking point when Nikki decided to regain custody. To two 16-year-old girls, it did not feel like protection, it felt like the loss of control. That night, inside a small bathroom, an argument broke out. No one knows exactly which words became the final spark. What is known is that violence followed. Suddenly, chaotically. One person restrained, the other acted. When it was over, Nikki Whitehead was no longer alive. What made this case especially shocking was not only the death of a mother, but the coordination between the two sisters. They did not act separately. There was no one who stood aside. The twin bond, once seen as something sacred, became the force that bound them together in an act that could never be undone. When police arrived, the twins did not run. They stayed, they confessed. There was no elaborate plan. No prolonged attempt to hide what had happened. Only two teenage girls, standing face to face with a reality they themselves had not yet fully understood. Jasmia and Tasmia were charged with voluntary manslaughter, not intentional murder. The court decided to try them separately. Two identical sentences were handed down: 30 years in prison for each sister. They were incarcerated in different facilities. For the first time in their lives, the twin sisters were separated. The case of the Whitehead twins did not provoke the same level of public outrage as others, but it left a deep and lasting unease. Two children caused the death of their own mother. Not for money, not from clear, personal hatred, but because a family relationship had been breaking down for a very long time. The real question is not whether they were guilty. It is how long this tragedy had been growing in silence. Because sometimes, the most dangerous threat is not an outsider but the closest relationships, quietly decaying, untouched and unspoken, until it is already too late. Number 9. Christina Atkins. Not every killing comes with screams. Some deaths arrive quietly, at the dinner table, in daily medication, within absolute trust. And sometimes, the person standing closest to you is the one waiting for you to fade away, day by day. Christina Atkins was very young when the case unfolded. A teenage girl living with her grandmother in Michigan. From the outside, there were no obvious warning signs. No visible conflict. No public arguments. No cries for help. Christina was not rebellious. She did not cause trouble. She was quiet, withdrawn, and difficult to read. And it was that calm surface that concealed what was quietly unfolding inside the home. Virginia Bentley, 53 years old, was Christina's grandmother. She took care of her. She gave her a home. She provided a sense of stability that many children never have. Inside that house, Virginia was the only adult. And, in many ways, the most vulnerable one. She never imagined that the daily care she received from her granddaughter would become the path leading to her death. Christina did not act in a sudden outburst. There was no physical struggle, no visible attack, no weapon in hand. She chose a different method: medication, small amounts, repeated, silent. Virginia's condition slowly began to decline: weakness, fatigue, pain that appeared medical, nothing that immediately raised suspicion. The end came gradually, and because of that, it was far more dangerous. With each passing day, Christina had the chance to stop, but she didn't. There was no sudden burst of anger, only a quiet, deliberate patience. What unsettled investigators most was not the amount involved but the time. This was not something that happened in minutes. It unfolded over days. When Virginia passed away, her death was initially believed to be natural. But the autopsy results changed everything. Morphine levels in her system were far beyond what was considered safe. There was no valid prescription. The investigation turned back toward the house, and every path led to Christina. Christina was arrested and questioned. She did not resist. She did not panic. Her confession came calmly in a way investigators later described as unsettling. The court determined that this was second-degree murder. Planned. Intentional. Christina was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The case of Christina Atkins did not spark a media storm. There were no shocking images, no dramatic spectacle, yet it frightened people in a different way. Because the danger here did not announce itself. It lived alongside the victim. Shared meals. Shared daily routines. The question is not simply why a teenager committed such an act. It is how a child could carry it out patiently, quietly, over time. This case is a reminder that danger is not always loud. Sometimes, it hides within trust itself. And when it is finally uncovered, it is already too late. Number 10. Nicole Jackson. There are moments when it becomes impossible to decide whether we are witnessing a crime or a final cry for help. A 14-year-old child, a rifle, and dozens of police officers forced to take cover to stay alive. No one died that night, but a great deal collapsed. Nicole Jackson grew up within Florida's foster care system. No stable family, no permanent home. Her life was defined by constant movement, adults who came and went, and the repeated feeling of being abandoned. Nicole was never allowed to grow up in the usual sense. She learned how to protect herself, how to doubt, how to survive on her own. A child like that, when lost, does not seek help. She looks for a way to escape. Nicole ran away from her foster placement. She was with a 12-year-old boy. There was no long-term plan, no money, no destination. They wandered until they broke into a private home. And there, Nicole saw something that would change everything. Firearms. Multiple weapons. Ammunition. In the hands of a teenager who had been stripped of control over her own life, weapons were not just dangerous objects. They became a feeling, the first sense of power she had ever known. When police were called, they believed they were responding to a routine burglary. But instead of surrender, Nicole opened fire. Shots cut through the air. Officers were forced to take cover. Parts of the building were damaged. The standoff lasted more than 30 minutes. On one side stood law enforcement. On the other, a child in deep desperation. Body camera footage captured Nicole's voice, shaking, angry, and filled with defiance. Nicole did not fire blindly. She aimed. She pulled the trigger. That fact made everything far more serious, because it suggested awareness. And it raised the most difficult question of all: when a child understands what they are doing, are they still considered a child? Fortunately, no lives were lost. No officers were killed. No civilians were harmed. But the line between life and death was stretched to its absolute limit. In the end, Nicole was struck and restrained. She fell to the ground. The weapon slipped from her hands. In that moment, she was no longer a threat. She was just an injured child, lying among armored adults. There were no more challenges. No more shouting. Only emptiness remained. Nicole was charged as an adult. Attempted murder, assault on law enforcement officers, unlawful use of a weapon. The decision immediately sparked controversy. Some argued it was necessary to protect society. Others saw it as the final failure of a child welfare system that had already failed her. In 2023, Nicole entered a guilty plea. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The case of Nicole Jackson closed without a coffin. But it did not bring relief. A child lost her childhood behind bars. A system was left questioning where it went wrong. Nicole did not take a life, but she pointed a weapon at society itself. And the question that remains after everything is this: if a child never finds a place to belong, then, in a moment of desperation, who will they turn the barrel toward? Sometimes, tragedy is not measured by the number of lives lost, but by the number of lives broken before they ever truly had the chance to begin.